Hello everyone and welcome to this third session of the CCNA online training. Okay. Now today what we are going to basically do is continue from where we left off. Okay. Just to have a quick revision of what we covered in the previous session. Basically we had an introduction to LAN. Okay. We understood what a LAN was. Okay. But before that we also started off with what is a network. We understood the different types of networks. We understood physical topology and logical topology, and we also understood that for understanding a network we need to have both the kind of topology, the physical topology as well as the logical topology. Okay. Another thing that we looked at was the host to host communication process, where we started off by learning about the OSI model. Okay, I told you that it's an open systems interconnection standard. Okay, OSI standard that's available. Okay, but that's a more or less like an older model. A newer model that is available is the TCP/IP model, which is a 4-layer model. Okay, wherein we have application, internet, okay, network, or sorry, application, transport, internet access, or network layer, and then we have the access layer. Okay, so these are the 4 layers that we have with regards to TCP/IP. Okay, now the next thing that we talked about was the TCP/IP layers, or we understood the individual layers and so on. Okay, and then we finished yesterday's session or the previous session with regards to Ethernet, understanding a bit about switches, the various LAN components that are needed. Okay, and then we also talked about a bit about collisions. Okay, issues that are faced if we have a hub environment. Okay, the replacement of a hub with a switch. That's what we talked about in the previous session. Now in today's session, what we are going to basically start off with is operating the Cisco IOS software. Okay, so it's part of the same topic that we were discussing about, but then today what we are going to look at is operating Cisco IOS software. So for that reason, I had asked all of you to install and set up a packet tracer on your individual machine. So I hope you have packet tracer installed on your machine at this point. Okay, I had asked you to install packet tracer version 6. So if you have a higher version, it's all right, but see to it that you have minimum packet tracer version 6. Okay, now so yeah, so all of you have it. So let's continue with this particular section of the topic. Okay, saying that when I talk about the Cisco IOS software, okay, now the operating system which runs on a Cisco device, like it can be a router or a switch. So the operating system that runs on Cisco devices is called as iOS. Okay, so the operating system that runs on Cisco devices is called as an iOS. Okay, so iOS, when I talk about it, okay, as you see out here, the iOS, when I talk about it, it is nothing but, okay, it's the abbreviation for, okay, inter network operating system. Okay, so that is what iOS means, inter-network operating system. Okay, now of course there are different versions of the iOS, but then typically the operating system which runs, or the software which runs on individual Cisco devices, is called as iOS. Okay, so when I talk about the Cisco IOS software, okay, it has features to carry the chosen network protocols and the appropriate functions. Okay, so bottom line is it can support a large number of network protocols and provide you with a lot of network features so that you can use those devices for carrying out the various network functions. Okay, it also provides you connectivity for high-speed traffic between the devices. It also provides you security to control access only to authorized users. Okay, so you can limit access to the devices only to authorized or specific users. Okay, so that will prevent unauthorized access to the device. It also supports scalability, okay, wherein we can add more number of interfaces than what it already has, and we can also add additional capabilities to the device. Okay, it also provides you with reliability to ensure dependable access of network resources, and then okay, it also provides you with a level of consistency wherein all the devices or the different models that you purchase from Cisco, okay, they all would provide you with a similar kind of an interface and a similar kind of a functionality. Okay, so that's the main thing of the Cisco IOS. It is consistent enough across all the platform of devices which Cisco has to offer. Okay. Now going along, okay, when I switch on or turn on a Cisco device, okay, the first thing that the Cisco device, be it a router or a switch, okay, practically in this particular course we are going to more talk about a Cisco router and a Cisco switch. We are not going to discuss about any other Cisco device. We are primarily going to talk about a Cisco router and a Cisco switch. So in that case, when we turn on these devices, be it a router or a switch, the first step that this Cisco device is going to do is it's going to find and check the device hardware. Okay. Now what is it going to find and check with regards to device hardware? Basically what it's going to do is it's going to check whether the RAM or the random access memory is functioning. It's going to check whether the various hardware components or the various hardware modules of the device is functional. Okay. Whether the ports are functional. Okay. It's also going to check whether the processor is functional. So basically it's going to run a post just like a machine. Post is nothing but power on self test. Okay. So when you turn on a desktop computer, the first thing that desktop computer does is it runs through certain checks. Okay, it checks each and every individual component of the machine. Same way, when I turn on a Cisco device, it's going to run a post internally and it's going to check each and every hardware component present in itself. Okay, once it has done that, once it has completed the post, the next part that is going to carry out is find and load the appropriate Cisco IOS software image. So bottom line is the Cisco IOS software image or the inter-network operating system of the device is stored within the flash memory of either the router or the switch. Okay, so typically when I talk about the iOS, it's typically stored in the flash memory of the router or the switch. So what it's going to do is when it's booting up, it's going to search for an iOS file within the flash memory. Okay, and then the moment it finds it, it's going to go ahead and load the software image into the RAM. Okay, once it has done that, the next step that is going to perform is search or find and apply device configuration. Okay, so basically what it's going to do is it's going to search through another form of memory called as NVRAM. Okay, so NVRAM is non-volatile random access memory. Okay, so we have RAM, that is random access memory, and then we have NVRAM, that is non-volatile random access memory. Okay, so the non-volatile random access memory is nothing but a memory which does not lose its information. Like when I talk about RAM, it is volatile. Okay, which means if the device is rebooted, the content of the RAM is lost. But that doesn't happen with regards to NVRAM. The NVRAM will retain whatever information it stores. You understand? Okay, so let me just quickly repeat where the individual components are fetched from. Okay, so if I talk about the first part, that is finding and checking the device hardware, okay, this entire process is called as post or power on self test. Okay, let me just put it down for you. Power on self test. Okay, so that is what it's going to run, wherein it checks each and every individual hardware component of the device. Okay, so the next step that it does is searches or finds and loads the Cisco IOS software. Now it searches for the Cisco IOS software within the flash memory. Okay, so whenever I talk about a router or a switch, it has its own either inbuilt flash memory or it might be an external flash memory that is inserted into the device. Okay, so most of the time the devices have a built-in flash memory, but newer devices typically also have an option of inserting an external flash memory. So it's going to search through all these flash memories for an iOS software image, and then ultimately once it finds the iOS software image, it's going to go ahead and load that particular iOS software into the RAM. Okay, that is random access memory. Okay, so that would be the second step. Okay, the third step that we have, okay, the third step that is going to perform is it's going to search and apply the device configuration. Okay. Now typically when I talk about the device configuration, it looks out for something known as a startup configuration or startup config. Okay, so that is what it looks out. Okay, so startup config is a config that is stored into the device. Okay, and whenever the device boots up, it's going to load this particular configuration. So it's going to search for and apply the device configuration, that is nothing but the startup config. Now where does it search for the startup config? It is going to search for the startup config into the NVRAM. Okay, so the startup config typically is stored in the NVRAM. So it's always going to get into the NVRAM and search for whether a startup config has been set. Okay, so if the startup config is present, it's going to load the startup config into the RAM, and then it's going to load or apply the device configuration. Okay, so these are the 3 steps that a Cisco device is going to perform when it is turned on. Okay, is the steps clear? Do you have any questions on that? Yeah, tell me. Okay, I think you have a question. Tell me. Okay, what is an NVRAM? That's what you're asking me, right? So NVRAM. Oh, okay. What does it do? So, well, basically NVRAM is just like a memory. Okay, a memory chip within the router or the switch. What it basically does is it stores the startup config. Whenever we save the configuration of a router or a switch, it's going to store that configuration into the NVRAM. Okay, so basically it's acting like a storage device. But then the main thing about this NVRAM is it is random access memory. But the only difference as compared to a RAM is NVRAM or non-volatile random access memory is not going to lose its configuration, or it's not going to lose its content if the device is rebooted. Okay, like when I talk about a RAM, okay, what happens in the RAM? Like whatever content is there in the RAM, it is lost when I reboot the device or when I power off and power on the device, right? But that doesn't happen with NVRAM. In NVRAM, whatever content goes into the NVRAM, it's going to store it. And even if we reboot the device or even if we power off and power on the device, the content is not going to be lost. Okay, so with regards to a Cisco device, the NVRAM is going to store the startup config. Do you get that now? Okay. Okay. So getting along. So these are the 3 steps that are performed by a Cisco device when it is powered on. Okay. So now let's talk about how would we configure a device, or where can it get its configuration files from. Okay. So typically when I talk about a router or a switch, or in general when we talk about Cisco devices, okay, typically it can be configured through a console port. Okay, so a console port is what is commonly used for the configuration of a router or a switch. Okay, but if I want to configure this router or switch remotely, okay, remotely as in through a modem or like through a dial-up network or something like that, in that case I have another port known as an auxiliary port. But the main thing about this auxiliary port is it is a port which is available only on routers. The aux port or the auxiliary port is not available on switches. But if I talk about the console port is available both on the router as well as on the switch. Okay, but when I talk about an auxiliary port, which is typically used for remote configuration of the device via a modem, okay, or via a dial-up network. So if I want to make use of this auxiliary port, the auxiliary port is available only for routers. It is not available on a switch. Okay, now if we want to configure this device remotely through a network, then in that case the router and the switch has interfaces, right? So through the interface I can either make use of telnet or virtual terminal sessions like SSH or something like that. Okay, so that's one of the methods that I can make use of, virtual terminal sessions, that is telnet or SSH. Another way of doing it is I can connect to the device, or I can store all the configuration files on a TFTP server, that is trivial file transfer protocol. Like yesterday, if you remember in the previous session, we talked about TFTP as a batch application, right? Okay, so in that case, the TFTP server is a server which will hold all the configuration information or certain files, and these files can then be transferred onto the router or switch, and I can load those files onto the device. Okay, so I can make use of a TFTP server, or I can make use of a web or network management server. A web or a network management server is typically a machine through which I can configure this router or switch through the GUI. GUI means graphical user interface. Okay, so rather than using command line, I can configure these devices using a graphical user interface. Like when we have a broadband router or wireless router or wireless device, we typically configure this device using a web browser, right? In a similar manner, if I want to configure these router or switch through a web interface, I can do that using this network management server. Okay, but then wherever you load the configuration from, typically or ideally, once you load the configurations would work or go ahead and reside itself into the device memory. Okay, now the device memory, when I talk about it, I am talking about the RAM. Okay, so if I want to talk about a configuration file becomes active only when it is loaded into the RAM. Okay, but when the configuration file is in the NVRAM, it is just there. It will be loaded from the NVRAM into the RAM when the device is switched on. You understand that? Now talking about the iOS user interface. Okay, so typically when I talk about the Cisco iOS, it provides you with a command line interface. Okay, also called as CLI. Okay, so through the CLI you can configure this particular device. Okay, so CLI is like a text interface that you have, text-based interface like a command prompt. Okay, like in Windows, if I open up a command prompt, okay, like you can see this, that's the command prompt of Windows, right? Okay, so just like this command prompt, this is all text, right? In a similar manner, you can get hold of a command line interface for a router or a switch. Okay, so when I talk about that, the operations would vary depending upon the different type of device. Like the operation on a router would be different, the operation on a switch would be different. Okay, but users have the option of typing the command or copying and pasting the commands into the console mode. Okay, so that command line interface which you get by connecting to the console port of the router is nothing but the console mode. Okay, so when you get or connect to the router or the switch via the console mode, you typically have different prompts. Okay, like depending on the prompts, you know which mode you are working upon. Okay, so we'll be talking more about the prompts as we go along in this particular section, but then that's the main thing about it. So whenever we talk about the command line interface, it has certain prompts to it, and depending on the prompts, we go ahead and do the configuration. Okay, so we can also make use of the enter key, okay, to execute a particular command. Like for example, if I want to run in a command, I have to type in the command, and after that I have to press enter so that the command is executed on the device. Okay, now as I was talking about the prompts earlier, okay, initially when you connect to the device via console, okay, you need to get into a mode known as an exec mode. Okay, execution mode. That execution mode is called as an exec mode. Okay, so there are two major types of exec mode that is available when I talk about a Cisco device. Okay, the basic mode that is available when you first connect to the device is called as the user mode. Okay, so the basic mode that you get when you connect to the device for the first time is called as user mode, and after that you can, for configuring the device, you need to get into the privilege mode. Okay, so remember that whenever I talk about a Cisco device, the first time when you connect to the Cisco device via console, you automatically get into the user mode. Okay, and on the user mode you cannot run any sort of configuration. To do any sort of configuration on the device, you have to enter into the privilege mode. You understand that? Okay. So that's what we are going to talk about now. Let's first talk about the user exec mode. Okay, so the first time, or the moment you connect to the device via console, or if you telnet into the device, or you connect to the device remotely and you get it into the command line interface, the first mode that you enter into is called as the user exec mode. Okay, so what can you do in the user exec mode? In the user exec mode, you have limited examination capability of the switch or router. What I mean by that is I can run some monitoring command, or I can look at or check on the status of the router or the switch in the user exec mode. I cannot do any configuration, but I can typically check on the status of the router or the switch using the user exec mode. Okay, so in the command line interface, the prompt would look something like this red text that you see out here. Okay, so it will be the host name of the device, whatever name has been given to the device. Okay, if there is no name given, by default for a router, the name that is given is router, and for a switch, the default name that is assigned is switch. Okay, so that is what it's going to look at. So it's going to look at switch or router, that would be the name of the device, and after that you'll find a greater than symbol. That greater than symbol indicates that you are in the user exec mode. Understood that? Okay, so in the user exec mode, you cannot do any configuration on the device. It is typically used for checking on the status of the device. Okay, so that's the primary purpose of the user exec mode. You understand that? Okay. The other mode that is available, other exec mode that is available, is called as the privileged exec mode. Okay, now sometimes this privileged exec mode is also called as enabled mode. Okay, the privileged exec mode is also called as enable mode. Now what can you do in the enable mode? In the privilege mode or the enable mode, you can do a detailed examination of the switch or the router. Okay, you can do some basic monitoring at the user exec mode, but if you want to do some advanced monitoring, or if you want to gather a large number of details from the device, then in that case you need to make either the privileged or enabled mode. Okay, so it allows you to configure the device. That's one of the main things about the privilege mode. And apart from that, you can also run some debugging. Debugging is typically used for troubleshooting purposes, which we are going to learn later in this particular course. But then debugging can only be run in the privilege mode. Okay, so you cannot run debugging in the user exec mode. Apart from that, if you want to get into any sort of configuration mode on the device, you have to first enter into the privilege exec mode, and then you can enter into other configuration modes that are available. Okay, so typically when you enter into the typically when you enter into the privileged exec mode, the prompt will look something like this. You would have the host name, that is either a router or a switch or any name that you provided, and after the host name you'll find a hash. Okay, so this thing which you see here is the hash prompt. Okay, so you'll see this kind of a prompt. So if you see this kind of a prompt, which means that you have entered into the privileged exec mode. Understood this part? Okay. So understood about the two different modes, user exec mode and privilege exec mode. Are you clear about that? Okay, so let's get on with the topic now. Okay, so when we work on the command line, okay, the command line interface also provides you with a help facility. Okay, that is, like, it's very difficult for us to remember each and every command that goes into a router or a switch. Okay, so in that case, if at all we are stuck with a particular command, or if you want to have help, or if you want to learn more about a particular command, the device or the command line interface also provides you with the flexibility of taking help or reading the help menu of a particular command. Okay, so you have context sensitive help. Okay, context sensitive help means you type in a command, and then when you put question mark, okay, it will give you more details about that command, as in what all other arguments or options are available with regards to that particular command. Okay, like for example, if I want to view something or look at the status of a device, I typically start off the command line with a show. Okay, but if I do not know the correct option of what needs to be run after show, you can just type show and then question mark. When you do that, it will give you the context sensitive help, or it will give you all the different options that you can put after the show command. Okay, so that is a context sensitive help. Then you also have console error messages. Console error messages are nothing but when you typed in a command, and if at all, like unknowingly you have typed the command wrongly, the router or the switch can easily tell you where you have gone wrong. They'll give you or provide you with a marker indicating where the command has gone wrong. Okay, so that's the kind of a thing that a switch or a router can provide you with. It can also provide you with console error messages. And main thing about the command line interface is it also has a command history buffer. Command history buffer means, like, it can remember a specific set of commands that you have already entered. That means, like, let's say you have entered show and something. Okay, then you have typed in command 2, command 3, command 4 and command 5. Let's say you have typed in 5 commands, and now you want to recall one of the previous commands. So in that case, the device will hold the information about the previous command that you ran. So you can always recall the earlier commands that you have executed. So which means you need not type that command again and again all the time. The device can recall or remember certain older commands that you have executed. Okay, so even that flexibility is available to you when it comes to working on the command line interface. Okay, so saying that, have a look at this. Okay, out here we are talking about a switch. How do we know that? As you notice, it says the name of the device as switch X. Okay, that's the name that they have assigned to this particular device. And then look at the prompt. The prompt shows a hash, which means this prompt is the privileged exec mode or the enabled mode. Okay, so on the privileged exec mode, they are typing in CLOK. Now CLOK is an incorrect command. Okay, so that's why immediately the moment you run this command, it tells you translating CLOK, and then it says unknown command or computer name or unable to find computer address. So bottom line is, from the message itself you can clearly understand the device is not able to understand what this command really means. Okay, is it the name of a device or is it a command? Okay, so since it's not able to do that, it gives you this kind of a error message indicating that it's an unknown command or computer name. Okay, so if you want to know more about the command starting with CL, you can type CL and then question mark. Okay, when you do that, it will give you a listing of all the commands starting with CL. So you find clear as well as clock. These are the two options that it gives you. Okay, apart from that, okay, in fact for this particular portion, let me go ahead and open up packet tracer so that I'll be able to show you a lot of different options that are available. Okay, so I'll open up Cisco packet tracer. Okay, so we'll be doing most of the labs, or in fact all of the labs, through packet tracer. So when we do that, I go into the help and about. Okay, so you'll notice it is 6.0.1. Okay, so if you have got a version that is newer than this, okay, please do let me know. But that's the version of packet tracer that I am using in this particular course. Okay, so if you have a newer version, please do let me know so that I can go ahead and download and install that particular version of packet tracer. Okay, so that's what I'm using out here. Now what I'm going to do is, okay, let's say I drag in a switch. Okay, now how do you do that? On the left hand side bottom, okay, out here, I hope you can see my mouse pointer. Okay, so that's the portion from where you'll find all the different devices that you can add into the packet tracer. Okay, so out here the first device that you see is the router, but the second device that we have is switches. So when I click on that, these are the various switches that packet tracer has. Okay, so I'm going to use the third device that is out here, that is 2960. So I'll click on that and then I'll put it up here. Okay, so what you're basically supposed to do is click on the device here and then just come up into this empty canvas and click here again, and you'll find that the switch has been added. Okay, do you understand? Okay, now the next thing that you're supposed to do is just double click on this device, and the moment you double click on it, that's the kind of an interface that is going to open up. Okay, so it gives you the physical diagram of what it is. So when I zoom in, okay, so this is how a 2960 switch is going to look like, the front panel. Okay, so let me click on original size, so that gives you an original size. But if I zoom in, okay, so it gives me a zoomed in value or zoomed in view of the switch altogether. Okay. Now these are the various interfaces that it has. Okay. Now as you notice, there are two types of interfaces on the switch. You have these set of interfaces, which may be most of the time fast Ethernet, since it's a 2960, and the other two interfaces that you see here, they may be faster than this one. Like fast Ethernet is typically 100 Mbps. Okay. I have guys out here having a similar kind of a version of packet tracer. Okay. But yeah, now as I was talking about this particular switch, so these ports are typically fast Ethernet, that is 100 Mbps. But these two ports which you see out here, these are the gigabit Ethernet interfaces. Okay, so that is what we have out here. Now that's the device. But then when it comes to configuration, you have to click on the CLI tab that you see out here. So when I click on the CLI tab, okay, that's what you would notice. Okay, so this is the boot up screen, and on boot up, it tells you that it booted up this version of the software. Okay, it has this much amount of memory, that is 21039K, that is 21 MB of memory. That is what it utilized for loading the software. Okay, now the iOS that it made use of is this one, C2960 LAN base MZ 12.225 fx.bin. Okay, so that's the iOS software that it has loaded. And where has it loaded it from? It has loaded it from the flash. Okay, so the iOS software, when I talk about it, it is loaded from the flash memory. That's what I mentioned before, right? Okay, so that is what it did. And when I scroll down, as you see, it tells you about the version of the software that it has loaded. Okay, and when I scroll down, it's giving me more information about the switch hardware. Okay, and that's the prompt that I would get. Press return to get started. So here I'm going to press enter. So the moment I press enter, this is the kind of a prompt that I'm going to receive. So as you notice out here, since this is a blank switch, I did not do any configuration for the switch. The first thing that I get is the host name. The default host name is switch because there is no configuration out here. And then I see a greater than sign. This greater than sign which you see out here is nothing but the user exec mode. Okay, now on this user exec mode also we have the option of putting up or taking help. Okay, like if I put question mark here, now these are the different commands that I can execute in this particular mode. Okay, so as you see, there are no configurational commands. The only command that are available is to do a ping, that is to test connectivity. Okay, we'll be learning about these commands a bit later, but you have the show command to check on the status of the device. Okay, then connect or disable, then you have enable. Okay, so look at the help associated with enable. It says turn on privilege commands. So basically you need to type the enable command to get into the privileged exec mode or the enable mode. Okay, so let me go ahead and do that. So I can type enable. Okay, now it's always recommended that you type in the entire command, but a router or a switch also gives you the flexibility of typing in the initial two or three letters of a command. Okay, now how can you check whether it accepts 2 letters or 3 letters? What you can typically do is just type in the initial letters and then you can press tab. Do you see that? Okay, let me just show that to you again. I can type the initial 2 letters and then when I press tab, there you go, it shows me that it's enabled. Okay, but if I just type E and press tab, see, it does not take it. Okay, now why doesn't it take it? That's because if I put E and question mark, it knows that there are 2 commands that are starting off with the letter E. So it doesn't know which command are we intending to execute. That's the reason it gets stuck. It doesn't work here. But the moment I type EN and then when I put question mark, it only finds that there is only one particular command that is starting off with the EN. So hence the tab will work. Do you understand that? So don't get confused that if you get on into a device and if you type in a particular command by its initial letters and then when you press tab, if nothing happens, that's because there may be multiple commands with those letters. Okay, so you have to type in the letters until the point where it becomes unique, and then if you press tab, it's going to complete it. Okay, now at this point, even if I type in this much and press enter, it's going to be alright. The router or the switch accepts commands in the abbreviated form as well. Okay, which means if I press enter out here, there you go, it takes me into this particular hash mode. Hash mode means is nothing but the privileged exec mode or the enable mode. Do you understand that? Okay, so remember that. Now if I type exit again I get back into here. It says switch con 0 is not available. Switch con 0 is nothing but switch console 0. It says it's available and press return to get started. So when I press return or enter, there you go. That's the user exec prompt that I get. Now if I type enable and press enter, there you go. I come back into the privileged exec mode or the enable mode. Okay, so now once I come in here, okay, once I come in here, if I put question mark, there you go. There is a long list of commands that I can execute out here. Do you understand that? Okay, so that is the main thing about the privilege exec mode. It allows you to do a lot of configurations out here as compared to the user exec mode. Okay, so the user exec mode is just to check on the status of the device, but the privilege exec mode allows you to do more than that. Okay, it allows you to do the configurations of the device. Okay, now coming back to what I was trying to talk about in the slide. Okay, so the slide was talking about the help portion of it. So you can just type in the initial letters, and when you put question mark, it will show you the list of all the commands which are starting with those letters. Okay, now out here if you notice, it just types in clock, and when I press enter, okay, let's say I just type clock, and if I press enter, there you go, it gives me incomplete command. Now what does this message tell me? It means that this command line which I have typed in of clock is not complete yet. So which means I can type clock and then question mark, and when I do that, it tells me that I have to type set, and then again when I put question mark, it tells me that I'm supposed to set the current time. Okay, so bottom line is, the question mark allows me to provide me with help associated with specific command. You understand that? Okay, now saying that, okay, if I go back into the switch command line again, okay, and if I press the up arrow, okay, so if I press the up arrow, there you go. Whatever commands I executed before, I just enabled enable, or I just executed enable command, and I just execute the clock command. So that's why you'll notice both of those commands are visible. Okay, now how did I get this? I'll have to press the up arrow key or the down arrow key to scroll through it. Okay, I can either use the up arrow key or the down arrow key, or I can make use of some keyboard shortcuts like Control P or Control N. Okay, so I have Control P or Control N. Okay, Control P represents previous command and Control N represents next commands. Okay, so either you can make use of the up or down arrow key on the keyboard, or you can make use of Control key. Okay, the Control key plus P. Okay, so that's what you can press for previous. Okay, so that's what you can use for the previous, or you can also make use of Control N. Now it doesn't mean that you have to make use of uppercase letters for the command. Okay, you can make use of the lowercase characters as well, or small n as well, but the point is Control N is for next. Okay, so that is what it means. So either you can make use of Control P or Control N, or you can make use of the up and down arrow key. Okay, so it will help you to recall commands as well. Okay, so that's what you can see. Okay, now in this case, like if you put question mark, again it tells you what are the next options that are available. Now if I go along, have a look at this. They have typed in clock set, and then they have typed in 19:56:0, so that means they have set the time, and after that they have put 04 space 8. Okay, and then when they press enter, it gives them invalid input detected at this particular portion. So this is the marker I was talking about. So it tells the user that there is something wrong in this particular portion. Okay, so if you press the up arrow, it will again come up with this command, and then if you remove this and put question mark here, it will tell you that you need to put up or type in the name of the month. Okay, you cannot put up a value, you need to put in or type in the name of the month. So that's why once you type August, okay, and press enter, it gives again incomplete command. It doesn't give you this message, it tells you that it's an incomplete command, and again there when you press question mark, it is asking for the year. So you're supposed to type in the year after that. So bottom line is, this is the kind of help that you get from a router or a switch. Okay, now here I am explaining these options to you because that is what you would typically get on a router or a switch, but don't expect a similar kind of a help in the CCNA exam. Okay, so if you are trying to attempt the CCNA exam at the end of the course, okay, don't expect this kind of a help to work out there. It may or may not work, but it may not be 100% accurate. Okay, so don't blindly rely on that. For attempting the exam, it's always a good idea that you're familiar with the commands that you're going to learn in this particular course, rather than relying on the help. Okay, now of course the new simulator software that is being used at the exam, okay, they are capable enough of providing you with help, but I would not blindly rely on the help and go for the exam. I would try to prepare for the commands and then go for the exam. Okay, so that would be a better way of doing it, because what if the help feature doesn't work? If that is the case, like you're totally stuck up. So just to avoid that, it's always a good idea to learn the commands before going in for the exam. Okay. Now, the router or the switch also allows you for enhanced editing of the command. So bottom line is, like let's say certain commands which we'll be learning as we go along. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, certain commands that we would be learning, okay, as we go along would be huge or long commands. Okay, like for example, let's say I just type in a simple statement. Okay, this is Franklin John. Now this is not a command. Okay, I just want to elaborate on a particular point here. Okay, this is Franklin John from Frank World Consultancy Services, and we are providing the online session of CCNA X 2.0. So as you notice here, it's allowing me to run this command directly as a single line, right? Okay, but now, okay, let's say you press enter. Okay, it gives you invalid input detected, and then it gives you a marker. Okay, but then like here it's showing you the entire line. Okay, but then in an actual router or a switch, typically you would notice. Okay, let me get back into the slide here. Okay, typically on a router or a switch, you'll notice that that entire statement is provided in terms of dollar. Okay, so it will not take you to multiple lines. Okay, instead of that, it will hide the previous portion of the command. Okay, with the help of a dollar. So which means if you take your cursor and move towards the left, you will notice the initial portion of the command. And when you notice the initial portion, the next portion or the end of the command will be shown as a dollar. Okay, so whatever portion fits into the screen, that is what would be visible. The rest is hidden using a dollar symbol. Understood that? Okay, so this previous portion is hidden with a dollar symbol, or like if I move my cursor to the left, you would notice the initial portion is visible, but the remaining portion is hidden with a dollar symbol. Okay, now these are some shortcuts that you can work upon when you're working with a command line. Okay, so you have Control A. Control A would allow you to move to the beginning of the command line. Okay, so let me just show that to you. If I go back into the switch right now, okay, now this is where I am. I am at the end of the command line, right? So if I press Control A, there you go. Look at my cursor now. Are you able to see my cursor? Okay, I know that the text is a bit small. Okay, but are you able to see my cursor? Okay, great. Yeah, that's not helping out even if I maximize the screen. Okay, so I'll just leave it at that. So when I press Control A, it's taking me to the start of the command. Okay, so remember, when I'm at the end of the command, if I press Control A, it's going to take me to the start of the command. Okay, and it's going to take me here. Okay, so Control A is supposed to take me to the start of the command. Control E is going to take me towards the end of the command. So remember, Control A is for the start of the command. Control E is for the end of the command. Okay, the other option that we have is Escape B. So when I type Escape B, okay, let me try that again. Escape B. Oh well, Escape B is not working here. Similarly, Escape F. No, it's not working here. Okay, but Escape B or Escape F. Okay, Escape B allows you to move back one word, okay, whereas escape F allows you to move forward one word. Okay, so escape B is for moving one word backwards and escape F is to move one word forward. Okay, let me try with control B. Sometimes control B works. Okay, no. Okay, so as you notice here, okay, when I press control B here, it's moving one letter backward. Okay, but if I press control F, it's moving one letter forward, but I'm not able to take in word. Okay, so I cannot move backward one word or move forward one word. Okay, that's not possible because the escape B or the escape F is not functioning or working in this mode. Okay, but otherwise escape F allows you to move one word forward. Okay, and escape B allows you to move back one word. Okay, so that's another set of shortcut that you have. Then you have control B and control F that allows you to move back one letter or move forward one letter, and then you have control D. Okay, now what does control D do? Let me move my cursor to here, and then if I let me take it to the right at the start of the command, like control A is what I press to take me to the start of the command, and then when I press control D, it's like a delete. Okay, so it's going to delete everything after that. Do you see that now? Okay, so these are some shortcuts that are available for working on the command line. Okay, now as a network engineer, you're supposed to remember all these shortcuts so that it becomes easier for you to work on the command line. Okay, but then for the exam, they're not going to test you on these shortcuts, but it's always good to know these shortcuts. So like because you know, when you're working on the live equipment, it's always a good idea to make use of these shortcuts to make your work easier. Okay. Now getting along, let's talk about the configuration part, configuration of the devices. Okay, so whenever I talk about the configuration of the devices, okay, as I mentioned to you earlier, Cisco IOS software, when I talk about it, okay, Cisco IOS software is typically available in the flash memory, but then when we boot up the device, it's loaded from the flash memory into the RAM. Okay. Similarly, when I talk about the configuration, typically the startup configuration, by default the startup configuration is located in the NVRAM, but then when I boot up the device, it's going to load the configuration from the NVRAM into the RAM. Okay, so that is what I would see. Okay, so remember that configuration is stored in the NVRAM, but when I boot it up, it's going to be loaded from the NVRAM into the RAM. Similarly, the iOS file is stored in the flash, but when I boot up the device, it's loaded from the flash into the RAM. Okay, so on the router or on the switch, when I type the show startup config command, okay, the show startup config command on the switch, it's going to tell me or it's going to give me the configuration file from the NVRAM. Okay, so that is what the show startup command or show startup config is going to do. Okay, so let me type show startup config. So when I type show startup config, it's going to give me the content of the NVRAM, or it's going to show me the configuration from the NVRAM. Now in this case, since the switch is blank, okay, I do not have any startup config at all. Okay, let me just quickly do something and save it. Okay, and now if I type show startup config, there you go. You'll notice that it's showing me some configuration. Do you understand? So I did not do anything. I just saved the config, and immediately you find that there is a startup config file that is shown. Okay. Now, where did I tell you the startup config is located? Okay, where is the startup config file stored? I'm just testing you at this point. Where is the startup config file stored by default? Yeah, a startup config file is typically stored in the NVRAM. Okay, so how can I see the contents of the NVRAM? Okay, how do I see that? Well, there is a command that is available, that is dir nvram : okay, I have a command which I can put up on a switch known as dir. Okay, now dir is a DOS command or a Unix command which allows me to view the contents of the directory. okay, or it gives me a directory listing of a particular location. Okay, so that is what I've done. I'm typing in dir and nvram colon. So nvram colon is nothing but the location, right? So I'm seeing or looking at the contents of the nvram, and what do I find? On the nvram we have the startup config. Do you understand that? Okay, so this is the way I can check that the startup config is stored in the nvram. Okay, similarly, if I want to see the iOS file, okay, I can type dir flash colon, because as I told you before, the iOS file is stored in the flash. So when I type dir flash colon, as you see in the flash you have the iOS file. Okay, so this is typically the iOS file which it had loaded initially. You understand? Okay. Similarly, I can also see the contents of the RAM. Okay, I'm not sure whether it may be supported on the switch, but let's check if I can see the contents of the RAM. So dir, and to see the contents of the RAM, I'm supposed to type system colon. Okay. Now, even though I'm going to provide you with the recordings at a later stage, I would always prefer all the participants out there to make notes for themselves, because it's always a good idea that you prepare your own notes while you are attending the session, because then it will stick into your heads much easier. Okay, personally I recommend that, because when you're typing in something or when you're writing in something in a notepad or something while the session is going on, it will stick faster, or you will be able to retain the information faster. Okay, so remember that. Okay, so if you want to see the contents of the RAM, the command for that is dir system colon. So when I type dir system colon, okay, as I told you before, on a switch or on a router, when I type dir system colon, it gives me an error. It tells me that invalid input detected, so which means it does not detect the system colon. Okay, because the RAM is represented as system colon, and we can't see the contents of the RAM, but we can definitely see the contents of the NVRAM, and we can also see the contents of the flash. Do you understand that? Okay, so understood what I just explained to you with regards to configuration and the iOS file. So configuration file is stored in the NVRAM, and the iOS file is stored into the flash. Okay, but then when the device is booting up, the configuration is loaded into from the NVRAM into the RAM, and when it comes to the iOS, it's loaded from the flash into the RAM. Okay, now when I type show startup config, okay, so when I type show startup config on the switch, it's going to show me the contents of the NVRAM. You understand? Okay, it's going to show me the contents of the NVRAM. But we also have another command, that is show running config. Okay, we also have another command, that is show running config. Now what is this show running config going to show me? The show running config is also showing me a configuration, but this configuration is nothing but the configuration that is loaded in the RAM. Okay, so let me repeat that again. When I type show startup config, okay, so this command shows me the contents of the NVRAM. You understand? The show startup config shows me the content of the configuration from the NVRAM. Okay, remember that. But if I type show running config, okay, it is basically showing me the contents of the RAM. Okay, so remember that show startup config is going to show you the contents of the NVRAM, whereas show running config is going to show you the contents of the RAM. Okay, so the running config is a volatile configuration which is going to be lost the moment the device is powered off and power on. Okay, so that is, if you reboot the device, the content of the running config would be lost. But when I talk about startup config, it's going to be retained even if the device is rebooted, because the startup config is stored in the NVRAM. Okay, so are we clear about this now? The startup config and the running config. Startup config is the content of the NVRAM. Running config is the content of the RAM. Okay, now I can type in show running config, show startup config in its full form, or I can also type show start. That is also good enough. Similarly, I can also type show running run. Okay, that is also good enough. So I can type in the commands in its abbreviated form. I need not type in always the commands in its full form. Okay, I can always type in the commands in the abbreviated form, but that's the main thing about it. So remember this, when the device is booting up, it loads the iOS software from the flash, it loads the configuration from the NVRAM, okay, but once it loads the configuration from the NVRAM into the RAM, okay, this configuration file now becomes the running config, okay. So the startup config file which was there in the NVRAM, once it's loaded into the RAM, it is called as running config. You understand that? Okay. So if there is no configuration present in the NVRAM, okay, let's say if there is no configuration present in the NVRAM, then in that case the device is going to run something known as a setup utility. Okay, so it's going to run a setup utility. I'm going to show you this particular thing about setup utility, but then that's what it does. Since if it doesn't find any configuration on its NVRAM, then it's going to go ahead and run a setup utility. Okay, so what is this setup utility? Okay, now this is just talking about show running config, which is nothing but the contents of the RAM, and show startup config, which is nothing but the contents of the NVRAM. Okay, so we already discussed about this. So let's go ahead. Okay, so as I told you earlier, running config from the RAM and startup config from the NVRAM. Okay, now the RAM and the NVRAM is with regards to the device. Okay, but then I can also copy the startup configuration or running configuration into a machine. For copying these configurations from the RAM or the NVRAM into a machine, these are the protocols that are available. Okay, the first protocol that is available is TFTP, that is Trivial File Transfer Protocol. Okay, Trivial File Transfer Protocol. So just to give you some more additional information on that. Okay, so TFTP or Trivial File Transfer Protocol works on UDP, like we already discussed about TCP and UDP in our previous session, right? Okay, so UDP is unreliable communication. So when we talk about UDP or User Datagram Protocol, okay, TFTP works on UDP port 69. Okay, so TFTP works on UDP port 69. Okay, then we have FTP. FTP works on TCP port 21. Okay, and TCP port 20. These are the two port numbers on which FTP works. Okay, so these are protocols, but then along with the protocols, we also need to know the port numbers. Full form of which one? Okay, I've got a question. Full form. So full form of what? Okay, TFTP. TFTP is let me just write it down here. Trivial File Transfer Protocol. Okay, so Trivial File Transfer Protocol, that is what is TFTP. Okay, so that is TFTP, which works on UDP port 69. Now let's talk about FTP. FTP is nothing but File Transfer Protocol. Okay, so FTP is File Transfer Protocol, and it works on TCP port 20 and 21. You understand? Okay. Now, since all of you guys have internet access, okay, so it's always a good idea that you open up Chrome. Okay. Now, why do I prefer Chrome? Okay, because when I talk about Chrome, okay, Chrome comes in from Google, right? So the advantage of using Chrome is you can directly search for port numbers out here. Okay, like for example, I gave you the port numbers for FTP and TFTP, right? Okay. Now let me talk about RCP. Okay, if I want to know what is RCP, okay, so I can always type what is RCP on the browser itself, and when I press enter, okay, RCP is nothing but, okay, now of course you would get a lot of information out here, okay, like you get a rich client platform, so mostly it's talking about rich client platform out here, okay, but then that's not the RCP which we're talking about, okay, so we are talking about remote copy. Okay, RCP out here means remote copy. Okay, so it's a Linux or a Unix command, RCP. Okay, so remember that when I talk about RCP, it's not really a protocol. It is a command that can be used with regards to Linux or Unix for copying data or copying information. Okay, so remember that RCP. Okay, you have to do a bit of a search, but then RCP is not a protocol, so naturally it will not have a port number or anything of the sort. But then it is a Linux or a Unix command which can be used for copying files between computers or between systems or devices. Okay. Now, if I want to have a list of all the protocols and port numbers, okay, I have IANA port numbers. Okay, so that's what I can search for. IANA port numbers. Okay, now what is this IANA? IANA is nothing but Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. Okay, IANA, as you see, like the moment I typed in for IANA port numbers, the first thing that I get is port numbers, Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. Okay, it gives me the expansion of IANA as well. Now, this is the governing body on the internet which keeps a track of port numbers, IP addresses. You know, we'll be talking about something as private addresses, public addresses, and all that as we go along. But all that information is stored or registered with IANA. Okay, so when I type in or search for this information, the first link itself, when I click on that, okay, for some reason my access to this site is a bit slow today. Okay, but ideally it opens up quick. Okay, of course there are a lot of different options, but I am choosing this particular option here. Okay, now it's saying the following page has become unresponsive. You can wait for them to become responsive or kill them. So let me kill the page and reload. Okay, just so that it loads up again. Okay, but I don't know what went wrong. So let me close the tab, open up a blank tab again, and I'll paste the URL and start again. Okay, ideally it opens up quickly. I don't know what is happening out here today. The page is showing that it's non-responsive. Okay, I think it's going to fail again. So what I'll do is I'll just close the tab in Chrome and I'll open up Internet Explorer here. Okay, and in Internet Explorer, I'll paste the URL, and when I press enter, it is trying to load, or it will load that particular page. Okay, I think it's something to do with that website or that particular section of the page as well, I guess, because otherwise it's supposed to be a quick loading page, you know, because it's just a listing of all the port numbers. Yeah, it's taking time here. Okay. Meanwhile, what I'll do is I'll search for the same thing again, IANA port numbers, and I'll go in for text format of the file if I can get hold of that. There you go. Okay, so I have this particular link, and there you go. This text file loads quickly, which is more than enough. But ultimately, what we really need is a list of all the ports and protocols, right? Okay, so as you notice, it starts off with port number 0, and it talks about TCP as well as UDP. Okay, so if I scroll down, okay, let's go on to TFTP. Okay, now it's a huge list, so it becomes a bit difficult to scroll and find it out. So instead, I'll use Control F on this page which will allow me to search. So let me search for TFTP. Okay, so when I search for TFTP, what do I find? TFTP, it gives me two results here. TFTP working on TCP port 69 as well as TFTP is working on UDP port 69. Okay, so that is what is TFTP. And now let me talk about FTP. So if I search for FTP, of course I have an SFTP as well, but let me search for another option of FTP. Now there are a lot of options with regards to FTP. That's why it's giving me a long list of things. But let's say I want to specifically choose FTP, so I'll put double quotes so that it will specifically search for FTP out here. And if I press enter, okay, it doesn't show me that. Okay, so let me try another option here. I'll type in FTP data. Even then it's showing me a lot of results, but yeah, there you go. Okay, so I have FTP data that is shown out here, that is TCP 20, and FTP, just FTP that is shown out here, that is TCP 21. I don't know why it didn't come up in the search window, but FTP is listed out here separately, and that is nothing but file transfer protocol. You understand? So this list can easily provide you with all the protocols and the port numbers. You have to just search for it and you'll get the info. Okay, like randomly, let's try to search for RCP if it has it. Okay, there you go. It shows me RCP, but this RCP is not the remote copy. Instead, it's talking about RCP as radio control protocol. This is not the protocol which we talked about in the slide, but just to give an example. Okay, so let's say if I want to know something about SMTP. SMTP is simple mail transfer protocol. Okay, so if I search for SMTP, there you go. Again, I have a lot of different options out here, but let me search for SMTP. There you go. SMTP is TCP port 25. Okay, so bottom line is this gives you an entire listing of all the protocols and the corresponding TCP or UDP port numbers. Do you understand that? Okay, so that's the kind of information I can get. Oh, okay, ultimately even in my Internet Explorer it opened up the page. Okay, and it's much more easily visible out here as compared to the Chrome page. Do you understand that? So this link is very good when it comes to knowing about protocols and their respective port numbers. Okay, so that's the main thing about it. Okay, so I can use these kind of protocols, and through these protocols or commands I can transfer these configurations onto a machine. Okay, now getting along. Okay, there you go. How do you configure or copy the information from one location to another? Okay, how would you do that? Now let me take you back into the switch and let me explain how to go about doing that. Okay, so when I go into the switch here, okay, now this switch currently has a blank configuration, right? It doesn't have anything out here, but I have already created the startup config, because when I type dir nvram : you could see the content and you see that startup config is listed out here, right? So let's say I want to like copy it to a TFTP server. Okay, so if I want to copy this file to the TFTP server, the command for that is something like this. You have to run this copy command, or you have to run this command in the privileged exec mode. Remember that. Okay, so I'm going to run copy. Okay, and then what I'm supposed to type in is startup config. Okay, either I can do it in this manner, type it in entirely, or I can press tab. There you go. Okay, it shows me copy startup config. Okay, so copy what? The source. Source is the startup config, and I want to copy it to a TFTP server. So to copy it to a TFTP server, I just have to type TFTP and then enter. Okay, so the moment I type copy startup config TFTP, okay, it is first asking me for the IP address. Okay, now we have not talked about or learnt about the IP address at this point, so I'm not going to go more into details, but then just to show you an example, okay, it further asks me for the IP address of the TFTP server. So for now, just for example's sake, I'm going to put up an IP address of 10.1.1.1. The next thing that it's talking about is how the file should be saved on the TFTP server. So let's say I put up the name of the file as startup config itself, so that on the TFTP server it's going to be saved as startup config itself. Okay, so there you go. It started writing the startup config. It's not going to be successful because it will ultimately come up with an error stating that it cannot reach the TFTP server. But that's the way you can copy a file from the device to a TFTP server. Okay, let's give it some time, and eventually it will come up with an error stating that it cannot communicate with the TFTP server. There you go. It says error opening TFTP. Okay, that's what it says, and it says timed out. Okay, it was not able to connect to the TFTP server. Okay, now I showed you an example wherein I want to copy the startup config to the TFTP server. Okay, can you guess the command for copying the running config to a TFTP server? You can type down the command in the chat window. Okay, I'm asking you to guess. Okay, so try to guess the command for copying the running config into the TFTP. Okay, try to guess the command for copying the running config into TFTP. You can put it up in the chat window, the command line. Okay, try to guess the command. So I want to copy the running config into TFTP. So how would I do that? Okay, not able to do that. Okay, let's type it down. So again, the command is going to be copy. It's going to start off with copy, and then you're supposed to define the source. Okay, now what would be the source? The source is going to be running config. Okay, so it's a very simple command. It starts off with the copy, and then I'm supposed to define the source. The source is running config, and where do I want to copy the running config? Into TFTP server. So after that, I have to type TFTP. Do you understand that? Okay, so do you understand the command here? That's right. It's exactly like the previous command. The only thing is, instead of typing in startup, I'm supposed to type running config. Okay. So now let me ask you guys to guess a command to copy. Okay, to copy the content of the TFTP server, or if I want to copy something from the TFTP into running config, how would I do that? Okay, try to guess the command for copying from the TFTP into the running config. Okay, so I want you to copy from the TFTP into the running config. So how would you do that? Okay, so follow the same method. Copy and then source and then destination. That's what you need to put. Copy. Okay, now whatever you put up in the chat window, it's incomplete. Okay, so the answer that I've received is something like copy TFTP, but this is not done because you've just typed in the source. What about the destination? You have to define the destination as well. So you have to type copy. I wanted to copy from the TFTP into the running config, right? So you have to type copy TFTP space running config. Okay, so that's the way you're supposed to do it. Copy space TFTP space running config. If I want to copy from the TFTP into the startup config, then it's going to be copy space TFTP space startup config. You understand that? Clear about that? Okay, so the logic is quite simple. You're supposed to type in copy the source and then the destination. That's how you're supposed to do it. Do you get that now? Okay. Now let's talk about another scenario. Now let me show you how to save the configuration. Okay, let me show you how to save the configuration. Okay, to save a configuration, what is typically happening? Basically, what we're doing is we are saving the configuration into the NVRAM. That's what I told you, right? Whenever we save the configuration, it is saved into NVRAM. Okay, but by default, where is the configuration loaded? Can you answer the question? Okay, by default, where is the configuration loaded on the device? By default, I'm asking about loaded, okay, not saved. By default, where is the configuration loaded on a device, on a Cisco device? Yes, okay, you're absolutely right. The configuration is typically loaded in the RAM. Okay, so what is the configuration in the RAM called as? What is the configuration in the RAM called as? No, it's not flash. Okay, the configuration in the RAM is called as running config. Okay, I think you're mixing up terms out here. Okay, so configuration in the RAM is called as running config. The configuration in the NVRAM is called as startup config. Okay, so if I want to save the config, the command is going to be copy. The source is going to be running config because that's where the configuration is loaded, right? Okay, so I need to type copy running config space startup config. Okay, because the configuration is always stored in the NVRAM and it's stored in the name startup config. So that's how I need to do it. So if you want to save the configuration of a device, you're supposed to choose copy running config space startup config. Understood this part now? Okay, great. Okay, so understood this part. Okay, so to save the configuration on a device, the command is copy running config space startup config. Okay, the next thing that I'm going to teach you about. Okay, I hope you're making a note of all these commands because later I'm going to give you a lab. So in that lab, I would leave you on your own, for doing the configuration. So in that case, like you need to have all these commands for you to work on the device. Okay, so I hope you're making a note of all these commands because it will be easier for you for later reference in that case. Of course, these commands are there in the slide, but they do not have explanations for those commands. So that's why, it's always good to make a note of the commands along with explanation. Okay, great. Okay, so at this point, I talked about how to save the configuration into the TFTP server, how to load a configuration from the TFTP server. Okay, I showed you all of that, and then I also showed you a command to save the configuration. The next thing that I'm going to show you is how to remove a configuration or erase the configuration. Okay, now at this point on this particular switch, I have a configuration that is saved or I have the startup config. But let's say I want to erase that startup config so that the device is completely blank. Okay, let's say I want to do that. So for the example's sake, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a host name on the switch and I'm going to then save the configuration. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So to do that, I'll type configure terminal. I'll explain all these commands as we go along, but for now quickly I'll type in configure terminal and then I'll type host name and I'm going to give it a name of switch X, let's say. Okay, I'm going to give it a name of switch X. Now the moment I do that and press enter, there you go, look at the prompt now. The prompt has changed over to the new name. Okay, so once I've done that, I am typing in exit. So I come in into the privilege mode, and on the privilege mode I'm going to type in copy running config space startup config. So this is going to save the configuration. Do you understand that? So the copy running config space startup config is to save the configuration. Okay. Now there is another command that is available to save the configuration, that is write memory. Even write memory is another command by which we can save the configuration. So there are two commands available: copy running config space startup config, and then the other command that is available to save the config is write memory. Okay, so make a note of both the commands. But with regards to the exam, the command that you're supposed to use is copy running config space startup config, because the write memory may or may not work. So we can't be really sure. But the copy running config space startup config is absolutely working command in the exam. Okay, so remember that. So write memory, when I do that, there you go. It says building configuration and then OK. So this is how you can save the configuration. You understand that? So at this point on this particular switch, I have saved the configuration. You understand? Okay. Now let me show you how to remove a configuration. What is that? I didn't get your question. Can you repeat that again? Which command are you referring to? Okay, the last command, the write memory, is for saving the config, like copy running config space startup config or write memory. Both are the same. Copy running config space startup config or write memory. Okay, so there are two options available to save the configuration: copy running config space startup config or write memory. These are the two options available. No, the erase I have not really covered, but I hope you understood it for saving the config at this point. Okay, great. Okay, so now let's get on to erasing the config. To erase the config, now which config are we going to erase? We need not erase the configuration in the RAM. We are supposed to erase the configuration in the NVRAM, because that's where the configuration is stored, right? So if we want to erase it, we'll erase it from the NVRAM. So erase it from the NVRAM means we are talking about erasing the startup config. So to erase the startup config, the command is erase startup config. That's the command. Remember that. So to erase the startup config, the command is erase startup config. Okay. So if at all, if somebody asks you to clear out the configuration on a device, this is the command that you're supposed to execute. So if you want to remove the configuration of a device, that's the command that you're supposed to execute: erase startup config. So when you type in erase startup config, it gives you a confirmation question. Erasing the NVRAM file system will remove all configuration files. Continue, and then in square brackets it tells you confirm. So I'll just press enter. So when I press enter, it tells me erase of NVRAM complete. There you go. Okay, so this is for erase. So the command for erasing the configuration is erase startup config. Do you understand that? Okay, so you have to be very careful when running this command, because if you accidentally run this command, the configuration of a device would be lost. Okay, so never do this or run this command in the lab exam, the exam, because in the exam if you do it, you are losing out the entire simulation, because all the configuration will be lost, which you do not want. Okay, so see to it that you don't run this command in the exam unless and until they ask you to do so. Okay, but in the exam they never ask you to run the erase startup config command at all. So never run this command in the exam. Okay, even on a live environment, if at all you are asked to configure a device, never run the erase startup config on that command, because if a backup is not taken of all the existing config, which means you would have a blank device without any config on it, which we do not want. You understand? Okay. Now one thing you'll notice is when I type erase startup config, the configuration is cleared. Like when I type dir nvram : you'll notice the content of the NVRAM is cleared, but then the name of the switch, do you see that? It's still switch X. It's not come back to the default. Even though I cleared the configuration, that is the startup config, the name of the switch has not come back to default. That's because currently this switch is working on the running config. Do you understand? Okay, currently the switch is operating on the running config. So if I want to clear out the config completely from the switch, apart from running the erase startup config, after that you're supposed to type in reload. You understand? So if I want to clear the config on a device, you're supposed to first type erase startup config, and then you're supposed to type in reload. Reload is nothing but a command that is used to reboot the device. Okay, so reload is a command to reboot the device. Do you understand that? So I need to type reload and press enter. So when I type reload, it's asking me proceed with reload, and when I press enter again, there you go, it's rebooting. So what is it doing? It did a post first of all, and then it's searching for the file system or the operating system, and then it loaded the operating system, and then the next thing that it did was, ideally it was supposed to get into the setup configuration utility or the setup utility, but since this is packet tracer, you don't find the setup utility here. But on a router, I'll show you the setup utility, because on a router it does show you the setup utility, but on a switch it directly comes up to this prompt, that is press return to get started. You understand? So remember, on a switch, it will all, even though the switch is blank, it will always come up to this particular screen. But when I talk about a router, it will take you into the setup utility or setup configuration utility. You understand? So out here, when I press enter now, there you go. You find that the name of the switch again has become switch, which is the default. Okay, you understand that? Very clear about the concept here, or very clear about the commands? Okay, great. Okay, so these are all the different commands that are available. Okay, so you have copy running startup. What does that do? It will save the configuration, that is copy running config space startup config. Then you have copy startup running. What will that do? It will copy the contents of the startup config into the running config. Okay, configure terminal will take you into the configuration mode. Copy TFTP run, that is for copying the configuration file from the TFTP into the running config. Copy run TFTP is to copy the contents of the RAM into the TFTP. Copy TFTP start is to copy the contents of the TFTP into the startup config, and then copy start TFTP will copy the contents of the startup config into the TFTP, and then to erase the configuration, the command is erase startup. Okay, so that was just a quick summary of all the different copy commands that I showed you. Okay. Now getting along, as I told you before, Control P or up arrow will take you to the previous command. Control N or down arrow will take you to the next command. Okay. If you want to see all the list of commands that you executed, you can always go into the switch. Okay, like if I go into the switch right now. Right now we just rebooted the switch, so there are no commands typed in. But if I type enable and then let's say configure terminal hostname, I'll just quickly type in some commands so that I can show you what commands are executed. Okay, so hostname and then switch X, let's say, and then exit. Okay, so I come back to the, sorry, I typed in something wrong, that's why it's come up with this particular thing that is translating. Okay, so once it has done that, now if I come back into the privilege exit mode and if I type show history, okay, so it tells me that these are the commands that I executed. Enable conf t, okay, that is the short form for configure terminal, and then I also executed the show history. So if you want to see the list of all the commands that were executed, that's the command that you can make use of, show history. Okay, now if you want to increase the size of this history, if you want to remember a lot of commands, okay, in that case you have a command terminal, okay, and then size, okay, sorry, terminal history, and then you're supposed to define size, and then the value. Okay, so let's say if I put the value of 100, what does that mean? It means that in the history it's going to maintain a list of all the previous 100 commands. Okay, so it's going to give me a list of all the previous 100 commands if I put up this kind of a command. Okay, so terminal history size 100. So remember, the terminal history size 100 command has to be put up in the privilege exec mode. You cannot put this command in the configuration mode. Okay, so you have to put it up in the privilege exec mode. Do you understand that? So do you understand this command? It will store 100 previous commands that were executed. Okay, so that is the meaning of this command. But if you type terminal history size 50, it means that it's only going to store the previous 50 commands. Okay, so depending upon the number of commands that you want the device to remember, you just put the value out here. So you have to type terminal history size and the value. Do you understand that? The maximum that you can go up to is 256. Okay, because like let me just show that to you. If I type terminal history size and when I put question mark here, there you go. The minimum value is 0 and the maximum value is 256. It cannot go beyond that. Okay, so that's the maximum that it can store. So are we clear about all the commands that we have learned today? Do you have any questions at this particular point of time with regards to anything that we learned today or in the previous session? Okay, great. Now, just to retain all of this, it's always a good idea that at the end of the session, okay, whenever you find time, see to it that you review whatever we learned throughout the session, so that it retains with you. Because if you do not study along with what you're learning in the session, it would be difficult for you to remember all of that, and by the end of the session, you'll again forget everything that you learned. Okay, so try to study the same thing again and again, so that you are able to remember everything, and then directly at the end of the course you can prepare for the exam directly. Okay, so I'll be giving you tips as we go along, but then the point is when you learn along with the course, it will be easier for you to be ready for the exam at the end of the course. Okay. Now, there are some other options that you can work upon with regards to the command line, but these options I'm going to talk about it tomorrow. You understand? So we are going to talk about the rest of the topics or the rest of the command line in our next session. But I hope this session was informative enough for you, and let's meet up in the next session and continue with the remaining part of the topic. Okay.